Okay, go ahead. Yes.
Okay. Dear colleagues, good morning from Mexico, good afternoon, and good night to some parts of the world. On behalf of UN Habitat, we invite you to this webinar on the report on cities and pandemics towards a more just and healthy future. Today, we are going to discuss one of the four papers on the spatial patterns and dynamics in the face of the pandemic towards a better functionality, design, density of human settlements. Colleagues, as you know, COVID has been for long a global crisis, but also an urban or a city crisis. The Secretary General at the end of July estimated that 92% of cases were in urban centers. Today we know that the pandemic has taken secondary cities and in many places also rural areas. We also know that the response to the pandemic is mostly or should mostly be an urban response. If we think in terms, for instance, of the response to the poverty, let me say to the poverty pandemic and the report of the Millennium Development Goals in 2015, we learned something important. Something like 750 million people were lifted out of poverty. And this report is indicating that more than 550 million people were living in rural areas or poor cities, small cities, most of the time. The response to the poverty crisis at that time was mostly an urban response. And this brought to us the need to look at human settlements in a different perspective and to look at different scales of analysis, starting with a regional perspective in which centers of different sizes were playing important intermediary roles in how to address the pandemic, or in that case, the poverty crisis. I would like to recall also that as the pandemic unfolded, we understood something important. The normal in which we were used to live, in where we were living, has proven to be bad. It was bad because it was a bleak social context with rampant corruption, rising poverty, escalating inequality, a burning planet, and important political divisions that were exacerbated and they were conducive to these conditions. The spread of the virus and the infections in the last decades, not only this one, has been enhanced and accelerated by a rapid and sustainable urbanization process, by biodiversity loss, and an increased human-wildlife contact. This brought the interface of human-wildlife interactions with humans and the chance for novel infectious diseases. Today we are going to analyze one of the responses related to COVID. UN Habitat has organized this webinar with the idea of trying to direct change which is needed in terms of policies, in terms of actions, in terms of data, to the understanding of the relationship between cities and pandemics. For UN Habitat and development partners, this is an opportunity for the organization to anticipate major transformation in cities, to formulate responses, and the need to guide all stakeholders in action. This report will serve for an urban perspective to understand different components of the crisis in the cities as we have documented and we have seen this. We will analyze in a global report that we are going to present sometime in January or February, 4 different important components of this urban crisis. The first one that is related to this first webinar is on urban morphology. Then we will have a second one on urban economy, urban inequalities, and then urban governance. We want that this report can dig into the most important impacts of COVID-19. Analysis, challenges, opportunities that face sustainable urban development and how it affecting and is affected by the pandemic. We want a study that can be strategic, that can scale responses in urban areas, that can look at different scales in cities and urban settlements, that can produce adequate data and means to measure what is happening in terms of recovery, in terms of regeneration, and in terms of sustainable solution to this crisis. I want, again, to repeat on behalf of UN Habitat, to invite you to the first of these webinars, of these global meetings. We have a first consultation in June 2020, in which we analyzed and validated the themes of this report that I just mentioned to you. We also thought in terms of method and also the guiding questions that could serve to prepare some of the preliminary measures for this report. Today, we are discussing in this second stakeholder engagement or meeting how to validate and finalize some of the report recommendations. We want to discuss with all of you, and this is an open consultative process, a series of thematic webinars. Starting today, tomorrow we will have the second one on the urban economy, and next Thursday and Wednesday, the third and fourth of these discussions. Before I start, I would like to explain to you that in this introduction, I would like to mention some of the important aspects associated to these important, I would say, general considerations that are going to connect to the most important aspects of this report. We live in a very unpredictable future. Some words will take over, perhaps, uncertainty. What is the meaning of the return? How we are going to operationalize the new normal? It is clear that we are living in a world in pieces. Society is much more radicalized, a political discourse that is polarized. Trust between countries and within countries and cities is continuously undermined. Consensus, as we understood it to be leading an ideal mechanism to consolidate leadership, has taken a back seat. We can see that global interdependence has been based much more on convenience than solidarity. And we need to understand that some things need to change. One of those is the notion of proximity, the notion of city functions, how we will address some important elements in which we need to rediscover, I would say, the pedagogy of what the space and proximity density entails, to offer an opportunity to move and to move fast for an objective of increased mobility to another one of increased accessibility. We need to rethink public space, planning, and urban development. We need to do another important thing, to think in terms of empathy, solidarity, and societal change. We need to refine the idea of believing in us, in media, in politics, and to rethink the notion of citizen trust. A government that in many countries and in many ways, in many places, can opt for completely different positions. One, for openness, to rethink the notion of togetherness, of how we can operate building bridges and opportunities. But in other places we have seen ostracism, closeness, bridges that are closed, and instead of that, walls appear. Sometimes even xenophobia. How we can connect this? Global agendas are still a very important reference for that, for planning, for policies, for strategies, for redefining budgets, for redefining consensus or priorities. Our agendas are a very important element, the New Urban Agenda and the SDGs, in order to interrogate growth and development as we used to see it. We want to implement it now in a different way in this new normal. I want to refer now to the report. We are going to start with a presentation of the key findings of the discussion paper, and this is going to be done by UN Habitat's drafting team. We will have 20 minutes for that, and immediately after we will invite 5 experts, new experts from different parts of the world, to make some comments related to this discussion, and I'm going to moderate this at the time of the presentation. We will have 8 minutes each, and let me introduce to you who are these expert panel that are going to make this comment. All of them very well-known people in this field. Professor Eugene Birch from Penn Institute for Urban Research in Penn University. We have then Mr. Thiago Henrique de Sá from WHO, who is a technical officer at the Department of Environment for Climate Change and Health. We have a good old friend, Mrs. Maria Bugias from Urban Facts. We have then Mr. Daniel Montandon, the Director of Architecture and Urbanism from University 9, the Julio. We have Mr. Roger Vandenberg, an old colleague from UN Habitat for World Resource Institute, Director of Urban Development. After that, we will open the floor for comments and inputs. We want this to be really a discussion, an open one. We want to learn from you. We will make an introduction from UN Habitat, but immediately after, we really want that you take the floor and you tell us what you believe is the best way to advance in this important section of the report. And after that, we will have the Director of Global Solutions Division, Raf Toots, who is going to do a summary of the discussions and closing remarks. Let me start and let me come back then to UN Habitat drafting team, who is going to make a 20-minute presentation on the key findings of this discussion paper. Colleagues, the floor is yours.
Yes, yes, Eduardo, thank you for this presentation. I'm sharing my screen. I hope. Is it showing?
Not yet, but it seems that it's coming.
Was it showing before? No.
Yes, it was showing before.
It doesn't work. Is it showing?
Yes.
I don't understand why. Well, okay, sorry. It doesn't really go in the right place, but I have it here. Sorry. Yes. So I'll share it. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. Apologies for that. So yes, I'm going to present on the so-called chapter 3 or paper on the morphology of city in the face of the pandemic, and the paper is actually organized in a structured way, and with the presentation we will go through the objective and the structure, the actual analysis and the recommendation which are organized through scales, and then the conclusion and the next steps. And we just to retrace what is the paper trying to achieve. We, as Eduardo has mentioned, we are looking at the relationship between COVID-19 and urban form and function, and actually building on that, reflecting on the possibility to learn from the pandemic and use this learning to reimagine the city and its connection with health, across different scales. So the paper brings forth, aims at bringing forth evidence and how this evidence is linking, influencing decisions. It is actually attempting to revisit the urban and territorial forms and system in terms of efficiency, effectiveness, and equitability as they are faced with the pandemic, and redefine the tools that are available to sustainably support city in their transition towards better health resilience, which is really what they have been facing with this time of pandemic. And finally, we would like to, in this paper, create the case or the traction for built environmental practitioner and also decision makers to include much more health as a key dimension of urban life in relation to the pandemic, in relation to communicable diseases, and in general in terms of health and well-being in cities. So the paper is organized in terms of the analysis across scales, as I was mentioning, in terms of regional and larger scale and the territorial system, the city scale, the neighborhood scale, and the building scale, and then it is attempting to go through 4 dimensions of analysis. I mean, what has been the relation between the urban form, morphology, and function with pre-existing as a pre-existing condition, and therefore in relation to the pandemic, what have been the immediate measures and how they have played out in different spatial and functional contexts. What have been the medium and long-term actions that have a dimension of morphological shaping or spatial reorganization, etc. And what are the lessons we can derive from this, and the recommendation. And we have under each of the scale 2 or 3 actually topics that have been more looked more in detail, and these are the one we will find also in my presentation going forward, so I don't need to go too much in the details of this now. But we'll start with the territorial system and the regional patterns, where we touch upon climate change, connectivity, and regional linkages and networks, and then the agriculture and food system. And For the first of all, under the climate change and environmental system consideration, we have seen a very strong call and understanding that we cannot decouple the climate change concern from the pandemic and health concern, and that this should be seen very much closely, not only because they are actually linked in many ways, but also because we are looking at building resilience and creating better cities in the face of the pandemic. If we fail to address climate change at the same time, our of course outcomes will still be very unsatisfactory. So we have been looking therefore at under this heading on climate change and environmental system, at environmental system in particular. As it been mentioned, there is a direct connection between the deterioration of vegetation cover and habitat loss with the increase of zoonotic diseases, which the COVID-19 is one expression, no? And so the link is very direct in terms of the prevention and also the increase on human-wildlife contact in general also spreads the viruses and creates the risk for new pandemic. So from this consideration, fundamentally, we have to we are deriving recommendation about environmental protection measures, the limit the use, the land use conversion, the establishment of protected areas, reduction of deforestation and the biodiversity loss, and also air pollution. And of course, on the other side, restoration, the need for restoration of habitats at scale and the reintegration of natural landscape into the cities. These two go together, these two recommendations. One element we have analyzed in particular is the question of air quality. As we know, it has emerged that bad air quality was a condition for increased mortality, but also probably for increased contagion. And we are looking at, in general, limiting atmospheric environmental pollution as a way to build resilience into urban and territorial planning as a focus, as an outcome of urban and territorial planning. So, and that requires actually that we look at the more compact and polycentric urban form that decreases the reliance on motorized transport in particular, and also a strong addressing of the sources of air pollution at the regional level. So this also links to another aspect of air pollution, where we have seen that working from home has reduced traffic and actually greenhouse gas emission, and minimized a number of wasteful consumption. So this somehow points us in the direction of possible transition to clean energy alternatives, and actually learning from these new models that are emerging or are expanding very rapidly to change our energy patterns as well. When we look at the other element of this regional dimension of the pandemic, we talk about connectivity and networks of city. And we have seen that initially the spread of the pandemic was very much related to the connectedness of cities and also on the other side on the ability to close borders that they were able to deploy. So when we therefore become very aware that cities as part of larger networks depend very much on resources from other cities and also rural areas. So how this somehow tells us that more close regional and urban-rural linkages can minimize some aspect of this rapid dissemination of the pandemic and need to be supported by actual redistribution of infrastructure and function. And also we have seen another trend which is important, that is a redistribution of works and function in a way generated by the working from home and remote working, and therefore a potential opportunity for a smaller city to reduce the dependence on larger cities and have a role actually in more important role in the intermediation and in the alleviation of the burden on larger cities. So these are sort of territorial trends that can be learned from and accompanied in some way. And then finally, the agriculture and food system is probably one of the most impacted and most sensitive in terms of the vulnerability also of urban residents. And we have seen a large disruption to this system in terms of the processing, the movement and access for city residents. So this gives us an opportunity to look at more localized supply chains for production and consumption. And sorry, you can close the mics if you are. Yes, and then also much more attention to logistics needed in urban and transport plans, and the prioritization of food actually in urban and territorial planning. So these are at the level of the systems, and we at the territorial scale. And of course, particularly these scales we found provides a lot of reflection that are then necessary to scale down to other scales in the city, because the implication of this consideration have an impact actually on most of the other scales actually. So in terms of the city scale, we have identified the equitable access to basic services and infrastructure, the urban form and function, mobility, and digital smart technologies as the four areas of consideration and reflection. The equitable access to basic services is something that has shown us how the cities that have a more equitable situation in terms of access to services have demonstrated less vulnerability, and also the presence of less vulnerable communities within their boundaries. And that is dimension of relation between spatial equitability and well-planned city with a more resilient and healthy city. So this is, I mean, backed up with some actually data from a different context, makes us very clear that we need to prioritize investment on the equal access to basic services and social infrastructure, and that we should actually target more deliberately impoverished neighborhood in going forwards for better resilience to pandemic. When we look more in detail about what urban forms and spatial inequality actually means, we see that despite larger city having more connectedness and being quite susceptible at the beginning of the pandemic to to contagion, etc., we see that longer-term trends don't confirm that density makes a city more vulnerable. And in fact, it is not a factor in the increase in infection, and is not a factor on other aspects. And actually, it has enabled a better emergency response and also better control of the contagion. And in very few cases, actually, it's possible to do a very detailed spatial analysis. But this example on New York City has been one of the ones that we have been using. The concentration of function and user who commute are a better predictor of contagion. So the concentration of function and users is more linked to cities where the contagion spread rapidly. So we actually need, as a conclusion, to look much more at urban density and support infrastructure that is well designed as a resilience factor, and advocate for it, and also avoid that the discussion on this pandemic carries with it a wrong understanding about density, and also consider multicentric patterns and well-distributed function in cities as a resilience opportunity. And this is, for many cities, is quite a structural change. We are also analyzing still urban inequality. We have also seen a strong emergence of what we have been calling weak spots. Weak spots are actually areas that have had a harder time to responding to the shock of the pandemic because of their morphology and situation in terms of services in particular. And we have identified the two, and fundamentally the informal settlement of the developing world, which are often severely impacted by the basic services gaps and overcrowding, and have had a very specific concern in terms of the response to the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic. But also, and maybe more surprisingly, the suburban areas, which, because they lack infrastructure to support mixed use, public transport, etc., they are actually also somehow affected in a more dramatic way. And this is important recognition that somehow weak spots are more diversified than we might have thought, that informal settlement need to be up in our agenda even more now, and that in general this weak spot need to be addressed and the specific condition solved, and also to plan more with growth while of cities, I mean, with the expansion of cities where we found sprawl, etc., needs to be planned better, but at the same time, we need to reduce spatial inequality and fragmentation within the existing city. And I think this is very much something that we need to discuss much more in terms of inequality in the urban space. This type of spatial pattern that reflect forms of inequality. We have also looked at mobility as, let's say, the glue that keeps the city together and enable its functioning. We have seen that the mobility has changed dramatically and has been also dramatically reduced by the lockdown and by the fear of contagion, and that it has been quite important for essential workers, for students, for production, and this has been particularly problematic in less dense and monocentric cities. And finally, the changes that are happening in mobility options have an impact on equitable access to opportunities and services. So there is really an opportunity that the COVID-19 creates a momentum for investment in sustainable mobility planning and infrastructure, and this is should be considered and worked on. We have identified public transport and actually non-motorized transport are the two most affected and important component of this reflection. No real evidence that public transport can be linked to the pandemic spread, but at the same time, the fear of contagion has had a lot of impact on how the public transport is being used. And we, as I was saying, also inequality and segregation, fighting inequality and segregation really depend on equitable access to safe and affordable public transport. So we need to actually work and redouble the effort for public transport to remain safe, reliable, and affordable, and efficient, and at the same time economically feasible for cities to operate, because this is one of the major concerns if ridership goes down too much. And on the side of motorized transport, the proliferation of non-motorized transport has been evident in a lot of countries, and it's been also let's say, incentivized somehow by regulators, etc. And we are having a number of cities that are expanding their non-motorized networks. So there is really an opportunity here to promote much better and safer non-motorized transport infrastructure and system across the city. The last point here, it is about this digital and smart technology. Yes, I have to conclude, but they have been dubbed the probable the sanitation of our time somehow for the importance they've played in this pandemic in particular. So we see a shift towards digital lifestyles in the work, in the leisure, etc. And with an impact really on mainly on downtowns, office and business space in particular. And we have also seen how the remote working has had a number of effects on how we could think on reorganizing the cities. And both in a negative and in a positive terms in terms of inequalities. So we can repurpose actually monofunction areas like the business districts that are becoming a little bit less utilized and used into more mixed neighborhood, or use them to address city-specific priorities such as affordable housing. This is also major structural changes that we can envisage. And the digital divide needs to be addressed in terms of the infrastructure and access to telecommunication for all, because at the moment this type of infrastructure are not necessarily equitably accessed. Then going to the neighborhood scale, we have looked at public space and the compact mixed-use neighborhood. Very quickly, public space has demonstrated itself really as a lifeline for communities and also for the emergency response in terms of accommodating emergency services, etc. So we need flexible design of these spaces that can support this function as they are needed over time. And also we need to ensure much more the equitable distribution and access to public space. We also have seen the re-emergence of the compact mixed-use neighborhoods as those where people have been able to cope best with the lockdown and where also access to medical and emergency support has been easier, etc. So many cities are working with the idea of 15 minutes neighborhoods, walkable neighborhoods, which are compact and mixed use. And we believe this is actually an opportunity to start thinking of retrofitting our neighborhoods into this type of more dense living that accommodates more local commutes and more local activities and more diversity of function, and also work again with the flexible spaces that can allow these neighborhoods to accommodate special function and separate activity when needed. So we are also going to the building scale and housing condition and flexible design, and we have been looking at the concept of density and actually realized that the real problematic part in this of this concept is not so much the area density, but the floor density and the overcrowding of buildings, and also the quality of the buildings more in particular, like ventilation, etc. So preventing overcrowding and ensuring adequate affordable housing with basic services becomes a very clear response to the pandemic in the moment and also in future. And then the importance of outdoor space is also underlined in relation to any form of housing. And the flexible design, again, at the scale really of the neighborhood and the building, I mean, at the scale of the building in particular, is also reaffirmed exactly with the same consideration that I had shown for the public space, etc. So to conclude, and sorry if this is a bit long, but we have seen multiple linkages between the settlement form and the pandemic. The role of the urban form in facilitating health and wellness through access to healthy food, healthcare, clean air, water, sanitation, and the support it provides to active lifestyle, and also in general the role of a certain type of urban form to make city better responsive and reduce the disruptive impact of the containment measures. We also have seen this very much linked to spatial inequalities in particular. And I think there is a general overall realization that spatial inequalities have also major negative effects on our collective resilience. And this is a very important realization, not only that they are widespread and important, but also their impact is much more important and severe. We know that we need to be still very much evidence-based, and we acknowledge the challenge that this research work, reflection has in doing this when data are still very much evolving, and also trying to work across different geographies and political and cultural context in each city. So this is one of the big concern in doing this type of work, and we see it also to some extent as an evolving one. And then policy formulation and long-term structural changes that I have mentioned actually need the multi-sector and multi-scalar tools, plans, and intervention, and also stakeholder commitment. And I would like to close here with the elements for the discussion that I leave maybe to Edoardo to bring forward with also the panel, which are about actually the adequacy of this report and this paper to to the ambition that he has set to explain this relation and work on it, which arguments are most prominent and important in the opinion of the audience, and also how this can be best translated into really guidance now for policy makers and mayors and urban practitioners as well. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Laura, for your presentation on behalf of the group of UN Habitat. I would like to remind for those that join later that this is the second UN Habitat consultation after a meeting in June in which we discussed and validated themes, method, and guiding questions. Today, we are engaging with all of you much more, not only to validate, but to learn and to get comments from you on this recommendation. We would like that this presentation is the platform for a wider discussion in which you will have from a panel of experts and after from comments from all of you and inputs on the most important elements that Laura Petrella on behalf of this group presented. Let me please give the floor and introduce very briefly, because of time we have decided to omit the curriculum vitae or the most important facts for each one of the panelists and experts that are going to comment. Sorry for that. All of them are well known, but we wanted to concentrate much more on the content and the substance. Let me introduce to you Eugene Birch, who is from Penn Institute for Urban Research in Penn University. She's going to have 8 to 9 minutes to react from her perspective to the presentation made of UN Habitat. Before you start, Birch, just to mention to you that this is the first webinar on urban morphology. Tomorrow, we are having a second one on urban economy, and next Tuesday and Wednesday of the following week, it will be on urban inequality and urban governance. So today, colleagues, concentrate your battery and comments on this presentation and the notion of urban morphology and the pandemic. Eugene, the floor is yours. We cannot hear you, Eugene. No. There is a problem. Leon, are you there, Leon? Can you, why Eugene cannot be heard? I can see that she's mute. She's mute.
She hit to unmute from her side. Eugene, if you can hear us, can you unmute from your side?
I can see that your mic is mute from here. Jeannie, would you mind to see how, perhaps what we are going to do, my suggestion, Leon, would be that Eugene can switch off her or move out of this platform and start to connect again. And we will give the floor, if you do agree, to the second expert to comment while Eugene will connect again, if not to lose too much time. So let me please present to you Mr. Tiago Herrick-Deza from World Health Organization. He's a technical officer at the Department of Environment, Climate Change and Health. Mr. Tiago, I hope you are there and you can reconnect while Eugene, because I can see she's still on mute. Please, Mr. Tiago, the floor is yours and we will come back to Eugene.
My colleagues, many thanks and apologies in advance for the drilling. Yeah. It's one of the aspects of the new normal. If you don't hear me properly because of that, I will suggest that then we pass to the third speaker and see if the situation changes here. But okay. So now I would just like to once again appreciate invite for continue contributing to this very relevant document and the chapter in particular. I think that the chapter has improved substantially since our initial discussion back in June, and I commend you for that. I also appreciate you having addressed some of our comments from WHO side. I have some very quick major comments that I would like to raise that I think are relevant. And the first one is that the chapter has valued breadth over depth. And it tries to cover several relevant aspects at 4 different scales, and this is an ambitious and interesting challenge. But while this approach is valid, I think it poses some challenges as regards to the evidence synthesis, as well as on how the evidence is presented. So some statements in the chapter, they seem quite bold and quite causal when we look at the evidence presented to support it. So I would strongly encourage the authors to rephrase some of those assertions to better align with the strength of the evidence provided. And also add words of caution as regards to the external validity or the generalizability when the evidence around a specific topic is presented for 1 or 2 settings, specific contexts. For example, now, when we talk about air quality, I would question the statement that air quality as such is a risk factor for infection and mortality rates from COVID. The best available evidence that we have so far is that air pollution is certainly a risk factor for many of the diseases that place people in a more vulnerable situation when it comes to COVID, which is a slightly different message that we are sending. Same as for density. I think that in some part of the document, the argument is very elegantly put. So density is serving as an enabler for many of the characteristics that would help us reduce infection and reduce mortality or the severity of these cases. But in some parts, we state that density is a protective factor. And again, I don't think that the evidence presented is sufficient to state that. And I don't even think that we may have the evidence for that statement as of today. But then again, for that, we would need to have the evidence, the available scientific evidence, more systematically assessed and comprehensively appraised. So this is just a general comment, and my point is based on the assumption and that this document is aimed at being evidence-based, right? So this is my first major comment. The second one is that I still miss a clear indication on who is this chapter for. And I think this is important for us to state what is the primary audience, because that will help us decide on the use or the level of explanation that we have to provide, that the chapter has to provide for technical terms. Now, for example, urban form, urban morphology, density, these things may mean different things across different fields, and they may mean nothing for the general audience. So I think it's important that that a decision is made on who is the primary audience, because that will influence the way we shape the wording and the technical depth of the document. Throughout the chapter, we refer to COVID impacts, and I think not as much as possible, it would be important to separate these impacts as in infection and severity or mortality, because spatial patterns and dynamics may have distinct influence on both. Just as an example, overcrowding may be much more relevant for infection than on severity, whereas access to health services may have an important impact on both. So it's not, to the extent possible, it's good to make this distinction every single time that we relate one specific aspect to the impacts of COVID. Then as a more conceptual comment, I feel that the chapter could be more explicit in saying that some of those welcoming changes that were put in place to respond to COVID will not necessarily become a permanent or maintained and sustained over time unless we have a concerted effort from several different stakeholders to make sure it happens. And this chapter is certainly contributing to make those links and to add to the argument that many of these actions should be kept in place and strengthened over time to address not only COVID, not only the next pandemics, but many other relevant agendas. And so I think the chapter touches on this point here and there, but I think it would be good to make it even more explicit that these changes are not taken as a given. And then a very final point from my side, and I'm 1 minute left from my 8 to 9 minutes intervention, is that I believe that the chapter's title improved substantially. I think it's much clearer now and even makes reference to one of the objectives of this guidance piece, which is provide the guidance towards better functionality, density. So this is very good. But I still struggle with the title of the whole document. If the title remains as such, the future state of cities in a world with pandemics. Because if we refer to any pandemics, the world has always been with pandemics, at least since humans settled. The event of outbreaks and pandemics initiated with humans settling. If we refer specifically to COVID pandemics, then the world most likely will no longer be with pandemics in few years. Now, it's more likely that this disease will become endemic, and then the response is different. So I think that last part of the title is less informative at the moment, in my view. And then just one minor remark on the objectives. I think that the document highlights very well the spatial features that impacted on the infection and mortality rates related to COVID, but we could also frame it positively, meaning that some cities and countries and regions were better prepared for responding to COVID because they already had some of these systems shaped in a way that was easier for them to respond. So these are all the comments I have. Once again, I would like to congratulate you for the amazing work. It's a very relevant piece. I can see a lot of work has been done on that and a lot of progress has been made since our last discussion. And we continue willing to support and to carry this message forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thiago Henrique de Sá. Let me make a comment, perhaps a correction, and I would like to hear later on your view on this and other experts. The title of the report, as we discussed in the first meeting, has changed. It's called Report on Cities and Pandemic, towards a more just, green, and healthy future. So, Mr. Thiago, please consider this title, and when we open the floor for comments, perhaps you could make some comments on this. Colleagues, we hear, in my view, extremely valid comments for Mr. Thiago. I think 2 or 3 that I would like that UN Habitat consider, Laura and colleagues, is what he mentioned in the sense of some of the statements from this report perhaps are not having this necessary strength and the evidence provided, and he mentioned for this air quality. Second one on density and the connection to the protecting factor of density, that I believe UN Habitat has internalized and has good information on this, and perhaps we need to make more evidence in this chapter or this section of this report, this information. And finally, the notion of impacts of COVID in terms of infection severity and different scales. The last point that he mentioned, I think, is also very valid. Of course, UN Habitat claims, and this section of the report proves very clearly that the different scales and territoriality play important roles in the understanding and the response to COVID. But Mr. Tiago is mentioning, what about the role of some functions or systems that were already there, how they connect to these different scales and spaces. So these are, in my view, some of the important comments. I'm sure Laura and the team has taken note of this. I would like to see, I can see that Eugene Birch is still on mute. Try to speak, Eugenie. No, we cannot hear you, but I can see that you are on mute. My advice to you is that you switch off and you connect again. And you did that?
The other issue maybe is to have, if he has Zoom open, Skype, if you could close those applications, could be the ones maybe holding on a mic.
Okay, would you mind to write, okay, you already did that. Eugene, our technician Leon is recommending to you that you close any other application you may have open, either Skype or any other from your computer that will be eventually obstructing the possibility for you to get access to your micro. As you do that, all for the sake of time, and sorry again, Eugene, we will move to Maria Buigas, who is an old friend from UN Habitat and from Urban Facts, and who has always interesting approaches to this from the urban perspective and planning perspective. Maria, you have 8 to 9 minutes to make comments to this presentation and in general to the paper that I'm sure you received first. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Eduardo, for your kind presentation and your words. And first of all, I want to thank you, UN Habitat, for inviting me again to discuss this work, which I have to congratulate for the effort to compile a document. And I would appreciate to say short, concise, and clear in its structure. A reflection that may not be completely new, but in the view of the events is more urgent and relevant than ever. I think that from my perspective, the most relevant is that there are issues here in this chapter that we have been discussing for very, very long, but now we have a chance, not only due to the evidences, but also a chance to push decision makers to move into changes that may stay in a permanent way. Tiago was saying, don't take it for granted, and I will agree on that. But I will say that we have a chance and a window of opportunity to push a little bit further. So in that sense, I really appreciate your effort. And I also appreciate very much the idea of structuring the chapter by scale. So given this territorial, this spatiality to all these issues and avoiding to enter in the classical structure by themes or by issues. And I think it's really relevant and important because not only because it puts the spatiality as something relevant, but also because it brings a certain language and an intention of the chapter to go, to get things done. It's not about urban theory. It's about get things done, action taken, and changes on the ground. And I think that it's quite relevant. Although I would suggest that in the section of priority actions and lessons in the different subchapters, the language that you use suddenly becomes too general. And I will suggest to try to go more concrete, more specific, and not so much into the, like these kind of statements, general statements that we may all agree, but at the certain points, we really have the chance to say the things as we want to say them, okay? I would not enter as much on the evidences, and I guess that I will have time also to send comments, written comments, but I just have some warnings. One, it's on at the regional scale, there are two things that I'm concerned about it. That is this exodus that we are talking, and that it's there and it's relevant, and I think it's the whole argument. I agree, but it's only a warning that this exodus, small and medium cities have to take it as a chance to increase the complexity of these urban places. It's not about commuting. It's not about suburbanization. It's not about, this kind of, it's really a chance for these middle and small towns to increase its complexity. Otherwise, we will just, in the medium long term, increase all the pendular movements again, and so on and so forth. Another thing, getting into agriculture and food systems, be clear, and I think that it's something that we have to be clear. Urban agriculture, it's good, and it's bringing natural spaces into the city, and has a pedagogic it's a pedagogic tool and so on, but it's not the solution. And I don't think we have to be very clear about that. Okay, so urban agriculture in the roofs and so on does not give enough, that the production is not enough to guarantee, the real food that people needs in a city. So in this case, I would say, like, be careful, okay? Because otherwise we are sending some kind of village suburbia messages and things like that. And the rooftop gardens, for me, otherwise they become like a makeup. And I would say it's more a social approach than a real change. On the city scale, I was very glad with the arguments on density, and I will add something that, linking with Tiago's comment, that it's to build evidences on that part of the density is not only required, or may not be only required for the evidences that the COVID has shown in the positives issues linked to density, but also because in terms of resources, countries are scarce. The scarcity of resources is global and will be global. That densities require at least a certain amounts of density in order to be able to deliver the services, the basic services that we have to deliver global wide. Okay, so that a link between costs, not only of urbanization, that you already know a lot about that, but also maintenance, it's something that maybe can be linked. And another thing that I would suggest as well, in the 15, another thing, in mobility at the city scale, the two examples, I would say Russia is not enough. Paris needs a lot of resources, and probably in between there are much more, maybe more examples. And I just want to aware you that, for example, in Barcelona now there is a citizen initiative to sue the transport public companies, because the crowded buses and subways, they are building a whole legal sue, considering that how can be that restaurants, theaters, cinemas get closed when people is forced to go in buses and subways, too crowded. It's something just to take into account. And my last comment will go into the neighborhood scale, that I would not miss the chance that this idea of the 15-minute city or neighborhood maybe is the last chance we have to establish a link between the traditional housing policies, just developing housing as a solution, in front of this, neighborhood of the 15 minutes, which is clearly contradictory. So maybe here we have an argument to reinforce this idea that we have been working for so long and pushing so long. And I will leave it here. Thank you very much. And I will send the rest of my comments written by email. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. Always very thoughtful comments. I'm sure the team of Laura has taken note of what Maria mentioned. I would like, just for the sake of some points of summary, to highlight. I fully agree with Maria when she's saying that these reflections are not new, but they are becoming more and more relevant. Thank you, Maria, for bringing some comments at the different scales of the presentation. I think it's very important to consider your point at the regional level on the notion of medium and small city sizes and the role they are going to play. In my introductory notes, I was given the example of the Millennium Development Goals and the role of intermediation that cities play in the reduction of poverty in many places. A word of caution of urban agriculture in the sense of pedagogy versus solution. In the sense that obviously it is important, all of us, we vote for urban agriculture, but Laura, to which extent that represents in the face of a pandemic a solution to this crisis as it is presented. On the city, I would consider that in UN Habitat, at least in some of my works, I call for optimal densities, which is a way of talking about population concentrated in areas that generate some economies of scale or agglomeration, or some advantages for the proximity factors to play better on the delivery of services. So, but the question to you, to the team, is how densities connect in terms of evidence to resources and to delivery, and when that can happen in some spaces. And finally, at the neighborhood level, also I fully agree with Maria that 15-minute city is a time to rethink the neighborhood sustainability and to move out from partial or sectoral solutions like housing, and particularly the conventional way of producing houses, and to rethink the space, the neighborhood, the social cohesion, and other elements that are again integrated strongly the notion of proximity in these neighborhoods associated to the 15-minute solution. Thank you very much, Maria, for these comments. I think extremely relevant. I'm sure my colleagues are taking note. I can see Eugene is still with the micro blog mute. In one moment, Eugene, I saw that your micro was open, and then it became closed again. I don't know what is happening, but we cannot hear you. I can see that you are talking, but we cannot hear you, and I feel very sorry for that. We have still 2 presentations. I hope, as Leon recommended, that you could either switch off or move out of Teams and try to reconnect. I think you already did that, but sometimes that happens and sometimes that works. Let me, as we are going to move to the other expert panel comments, to tell to all the people that are connected today, and we have an impressive list of something like 140 people, and I'm very happy for that, to tell you that when we are going to move to comments, you could start now if you are able to write on the chat some of your comments, and we will take it from them. However, of course, we will open the micro for you to talk, understanding that your responses, your comments, your ideas, your suggestions will be always taken, but please, when you do it 1 minute. Don't do a new exposition. And the idea here is to get your comments. So 2 options: you write, we will take it. You raise your hand in the feature of the hand there, and we will give you the floor, and you will make a presentation. Eugene, you are still blocked, I can see. I'm going to give the floor to Daniel Montadon from University 9 de Julio. Bem-vindo. You are Director of Architecture and Urbanism. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eduardo. Thank you, UN, for the invitation and the opportunity to share knowledge, and mainly to learn many things. I think I would like to congratulate the work I liked a lot the draft of the report. I prepared the presentation here about some concerns related to Brazilian and São Paulo experience. So I will share some. Are you seeing the presentation?
Yes.
Okay. So okay, thank you very much again. The idea is to share some evidences and some concerns about São Paulo. I think we are talking here about large urban area urban planning. So we are not talking about small cities and medium cities and mainly the huge urban areas. So there are two parts. First of all, I would like to talk about some changes in São Paulo generated by pandemic. Of course, like Tiago saw, we are talking about COVID pandemic. So the pandemic affected the low income and older population much more. As we can see here, older people and lower income were more affected here. The data is not updated, but it's relevant in the beginning, in May 18, in the beginning of pandemic effects in São Paulo. So at the same time, we have more people, the mortality rate is higher in people that have the until 3 minimum wages. So low income population, there are also 70% of mortality rate. And why it occurs? Because we have to analyze not exactly the index of each city, but how it happens inner city. I think it's very important. We have here the evolution of mortality rate in São Paulo. This is the municipality of São Paulo. Population is 12 millions of inhabitants. So darker shows the higher mortality rate in each neighborhood in São Paulo. So as we can see, this part of the city, the mortality rate is low, and in the peripheral area, the mortality rate is higher. So we have to cross and match with the index of social vulnerability. As we can see, as darker is the pattern and the boundary, we can see the highest mortality rate in the south, the east. So we can see here more people, more poor people living here, living in the south, living in the north, living in this part of the city. So we can see in this part, richest people, the mortality rate is not increasing. But this is the density rate compared with mortality rate. As you can see here, this is the part of São Paulo that everybody visits when travel to São Paulo, is the expanded downtown area. So as we can see, in this area, there is a high density in this part. So it's not a correlation between high density and the increase of mortality rate. The problem is not exactly the density, but the vulnerability. This map shows the income concentration. As we can see, the same in this part of the city, the low mortality rate, there is a high income concentration in this part of the city. So there are some evidences that the problem is not high density. The problem is inequalities in the territory. And we cannot analyze the city for an example, the data information about the whole city, because in São Paulo, there is the medium, the average of each data is, I think it's not uniform in the whole territory. So there are the information, the variation of the intensity of traffic congestion in some metropolitan areas in Latin America and the Caribbean. We can see here in São Paulo, the reduction, the decrease of traffic congestion was very big in the beginning of pandemics. At the same time, the reduction of public transport in selected cities in Latin America, the same, São Paulo, as we can see here, Lima, Santiago. There are many, the reduction is very relevant. Of course, the average reduction of the number of passengers was 80%. 32 million passengers in Brazil stopped being transported per day, and the pandemic reduced bus emissions by 50% in São Paulo. So the reason of the increase of the quality of the air. So there are some informations relevant about evidences of changing the city related to pandemics. I will also show an information about work from home. Look, we have 200 million inhabitants in Brazil. 79 million are economically active population, but only 10% of this population is working from home. So when we are talking about lockdown, it has an effect for only 10 or 15% of the population. Most part of people must work out of home. At the same time, people that work at home, there is some evidences, are people with high graduation education. There is another evidence, so most part of people needs to work outside, needs to take bus, to take train, to take public transport, so it's a huge issue for us. So this is some evidences and changes in the cities related to pandemics. And I have some consideration post-pandemic city planning. We heard a lot about 15-minute city, creation of new centralities. We also saw in some cities in Brazil displacement of housing outside large urban centers, emptying corporate buildings. Many districts of corporate of a high concentration of jobs are empty now in corporate buildings because people are working at home, and it impacts a lot some neighborhoods and some districts. But I think the huge problem is urban inequalities that was intensified by the pandemic. So to what extent will these changes really be significant? At what scale should they occur? For how long? After all, our concepts of sustainable urban development still valid? So I have the hypothesis that I think in the report we can see not with a high emphasis that pandemic reinforced the concepts of sustainable urban development that have been built in the last decades. So what it means, what we discussed in your urban agenda is valid. I think it's valid, but we have some kind of ephemeral urban planning and some issues to be adopted during maybe a year, 2 years. So I think there is something that it must be clear in the report is the message. We are talking about message for all stakeholders. We are talking about message for governments, to governments. I think it's very important because I have these 6 points. Maybe the first of all, I think it's very important. I don't know if exactly in the topic of this webinar, but it's urgent to enhance an agenda of high public investment to overcome urban needs. As we can see in Brazil and other countries, the economic crisis brought a practical of partnership in urban development, private investments, and as you can see, it's necessary high public investments. National governments and local governments must invest because it's the only way to overcome urban needs, to overcome urban inequalities. The work from home, I think it's good, contributes to reducing the traffic jam and brings quality of life up to people, but it's important to remember, for an example, in Brazil and other countries, it covers a small portion of the population. So I think it's important to address some recommendations about that because it can change the way of practicing public services also, and some, of course, private works, private jobs, sorry. It's important to explore new centralities. I think it's an information that people are talking about, but I think many parts of many cities, it's significant to change urban law, change zoning, to explore more mixed uses in order to avoid daily displacement of people. I think it's important. In practical actions, what is to explore, consolidate new centralities? I think there is a part that is related to changes in urban laws and zonings. For some time, it will be necessary a kind of sanitary tactical urbanism and adaptation in building regulations. For an example, the references of capacity in buildings, it's very important to, we are relativizing this in many places, but it's ephemeral. So we will not change the public spaces. I think in 5 years, we are in a normal situation. So it's ephemeral. We have to take care and not to change urban planning according to pandemic situation. We are in an ephemeral situation. So I think we have some information here in Brazil that people are buying more cars because of prejudice with the public transport. So I think it requires efforts by the government to change this, because there was a reduction of using public transportation. It was decreasing in our cities. So I think it's also important. And the last one, we are seeing in Brazil many changes of laws, urban planning, master plans, by the argument of the necessity of economic growth and job creation. But we can avoid some. It happens in discriminated way in our city. So I think it's important not only a technical draft and report, but also how is the political message of UN Habitat related to that. So I also can bring other contributions to the report. Thank you very much, and we can discuss more after the presentations.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Obrigado. I think you opted for something very interesting. More than commenting on the report itself, is to bring a strong evidence, at least for the part of inequalities and spatial analysis. I think this information is very rich, particularly the tables that you presented at the beginning. In my view, the team working on spatial inequalities and poverty and inequality, the group number 2, may benefit from these tables, and Paula can take some of this information for this analysis. Laura and the team, in my view, it will be interesting to see how some of this material can be connected to the weak spots that you were referring to, and also to the index that we developed in UN Habitat that has not made reference, the Spatial Vulnerability Index, because this index touches in 3 elements of possibility of contagious in cities. The place associated to housing, second to transport, understanding what Daniel mentioned, that is not public transport per se, is inadequate public transport, and we need to find ways of privileging public transport to avoid some social and economic important disruptions and commuting disruptions. But we took some of your recommendations, which I believe are still interesting. The public investment, of course, the sanitary tactical urbanism, and other elements. Some people are writing on the chat. I'm taking note, and when we open for comments and discussions, I will give the floor, or at least to make some of the comments that were written here. I hope Eugene is still there. I don't see her now anymore.
Yes, you can hear via the WhatsApp from my phone.
Okay, Eugene, I'm very sorry because of this situation that has been so unfortunate with you, but we will give you the floor, and I hope all of us we will hear you loud and clear. The micro is yours.
Thank you very much, Edward. We created a workaround, so no problem. In this digital age, we will get through. At any rate, I'd like to commend you for this important study. I'm commending you because you're underlining the importance of place when we think about how we're going to react to this pandemic and to future shocks. I think we cannot emphasize more the importance of the physicality, the morphology, the place in thinking about public policies and private policies that will go forward, and thinking about how we create sustainable development, how we pursue the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, and the new urban agenda. So often, our colleagues who are participating in these reform movements do not really have a sense of what place means. So I think we need to continue to emphasize this as we go forward. Secondly, I'd like to, again, appreciate, as others have before me, in the growth and the evolution of this report. It was quite fragmentary in the beginning, and it has moved along very nicely in terms of collecting a good amount of evidence and small case studies and putting together some policy recommendations. And in fact, I'd say that it does 3 things. Number 1, it works very hard to correct misinformation about the causes of the pandemic and some of the solutions for what we need to do when we think about place and when we think about recovery. Secondly, it does provide a narrative of how to do the recovery. There are other methods as well, but this, again, the idea of having place at the center of recovery is a narrative that I think we need to continue to reinforce, because this will set the scene for future policy. I would, however, point out that there's competition for this narrative that we're putting forward here. The competition is coming from the pressure to deal with the economic hardships that the pandemic and other shocks provide. So somehow we need in this report, I know we'll have the economic piece tomorrow, but we need within this report to draw the relationship between the importance of having well-planned places that respond to pandemics and future shocks as a very elemental part of the economic recovery of places. If you look at the policies that have gone forward, and in particular if you look at the recent statement of the G20, which just met over the past weekend, there was never a mention in their communique of place. There was mentions of the pandemic. There was mentions of monetary and fiscal policies, but none of it was brought down to the very places that we're talking about in this report: the region, the city, the neighborhood, and the block. Clearly, you wouldn't expect national leaders to be able to get to the block, but you would expect them to understand that basically urban places are creating 70 to 80% of the global GDP. Therefore, it's really important to make this link between place and economy. I think our previous speakers have done very well in making the relationship between the questions of equity, which is the third part of any sort of recovery: the environmental part, the economic part, and the equitable part. I'd also like to point out that this work really is a collection and displays responses to basically 20 years of theory that have gone before us. And I would not discount theory, though one of our previous speakers said we need to have practical situations. Of course we need to have practical situations, but they need to be built on some sort of framework about what works and what doesn't work, how we can predict how policies might play out. And so I would point back to 1999 when you had the European perspective on spatial development. I would point back, which really talked a tremendous amount about the necessity of integration of regions, of the urban-rural continuum. And I think we have talked a little bit about that in this report. Maybe a little more could be talked about in terms of that continuum and the interdependence of all human settlements on each other and the special functions that each one has. Everything from ecosystem services to food production to the creation of information that goes from specialized places in cities back to rural areas and so forth. So I think this business of talking about synergies and continual relationships within regions would be extremely important to underline. I would then point to the 2009 World Bank report on the new economic geography. And in that report, the economists suddenly discovered density, suddenly discovered distance, and suddenly discovered division. And they talked about the necessity of creating positive relationships between these three elements in order to produce economic prosperity. With regard to the word density, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about density that, again, this report could work a little bit more on showing different ways of expressing density. We all take it for granted that density means agglomeration, means lots of people together, it means lots of exchanges of ideas, but what does it mean in the physical arrangements of things? A few years ago, a study was done which showed three different types of building arrangements at the block level now. Of course, we're going to assemble blocks to neighborhoods into cities, showing basically you could have the tower in the park, or you could have lower, less centralized arrangements, the same density, but would have very different kinds of relationships in terms of how people entered and exited the various spaces. You have at the UN Habitat the ability to bring the architecture of density in all scales in images that would really resonate with people who don't understand space and physical place. So I'd like to see a lot more discussion about density and the different kinds of densities that we have around the world. And lastly, the third area of knowledge and so forth that has, of course, emerged over time is the differences between the global north and the global south. Much of the evidence in this report is based on global north evidence. Perhaps that's because that's where there's been a lot of activity in terms of scholarship and observations and so forth about what has happened and what needs to happen in the global north. Many of the examples in your report are from the United States, where there's been certainly a tremendous amount of energy devoted by the private and public sector in thinking about how to react to this pandemic. It would be wonderful to find more global south examples about the kinds of adaptations that need to be made as we think about the priority places for work. I would also commend to you a lot of work that's been done already. Perhaps you should reference it in some way. The OECD and its city responses work. The UCLG has assembled a series of things. The World Bank has had 31 lectures, I think, on this topic. C40 has a statement on building back better. The U20 has work as well. So I think we need to reach out with this work. Again, placing this work, your work, in its physicality at the center of things, but to reach out to these organizations. I think basically there's a great advantage in my coming last here because we have had some critiques about the 12 priority areas. And rather than go through each one, I think I would say that I think you're on target with what you have selected. You basically, if I counted them up correctly, have 12 priority areas, each relating to a particular scale. I think it would be really useful to start out this study, in terms of organization, this study, with the fact that you have identified 12 priority areas and perhaps add some priorities to the priority areas. In other words, what is most important to think about, even though you're thinking about different scales? I'm thinking of your audience. I'm thinking of your audience, hopefully, as public and private decision makers. And what they need to know, basically, is what should they do first? What has to be attacked first? How does it need to be attacked? And at what levels does it need to be attacked? So in terms of the organization of the report, I would have basically a beginning that is not an executive summary that's very wordy, but it would be an executive summary that says, okay, folks, here are the 12 things you need to do. Boom, boom, boom. You need to address air quality. You need to address green and blue networks. You need to talk about connectivity. You need to think about food systems. I agree with the previous speaker who said you're not going to solve with urban agriculture. In fact, in that food sections part, I would like to see a lot more discussion of how food is produced worldwide for folks and what are some of the issues that have been illustrated in this particular pandemic. And then you could obviously go through all the points that you've made in the other studies. So thinking about the audience, thinking of how to present this, and thinking about it in a very succinct way to get that message apart. Lastly, I would like to say that I think this is really a very, very important platform for going forward. Laura said this was an evolving study. I think you need to make a statement. You need to make a statement that this is the first platform, the basis around which data and evidence, such as we just saw in the Sao Paulo example, will be collected in order to express the contextual differences that exist around the world for the different places that are trying to experience recovery and build back better, not build back as they did before, against that pressure of building back as they did before, so that this becomes a platform into which maybe every year more studies, more evidence is poured into it. In other words, what I'm recommending is this become sort of an IPC type report that grows over time as evidence develops. Right now, what we're dealing with in terms of evidence are a series of case studies that are responses that cities have made, but we don't have the evidence that says, all right, Milan has done 22 more miles of bike paths in the city. How has this affected the health, the prosperity, dealt with the inequity and environmental issues that the urban morphology for a green, I'm trying to go back to your title, for a green and successful city will address. In other words, you've laid it out. We have some examples, but we don't have the outcomes of these examples, and it's too soon. So don't expect to have them now. I'm not criticizing you for not having them. I'm saying it's too soon to have them, but the studies will come, and the studies will come, need to be built into this, and perhaps then those priorities will be tinkered a little bit in terms of which ones are the most important, but you will be building them on the evidence that certain policies have resulted in the kinds of outcomes that you are looking for. But all in all, I just want to, again, say that this is an extremely important report. The fact that place matters in all that we do is a message, a narrative that those of us on the call completely understand, but we are a select few who are very sensitive to this idea of place mattering. And I think the message that we need to get out in a very effective way, both through words and through images and through evidence, is that place matters, that morphology can be changed, that public policy needs to address this, that context matters within these addressing of these issues, and that this report is the beginning of a long-term evidence-based test of how to create public policy that will enhance urban development and sustainable development around the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eugene. You touched in many very fundamental, I would say, policy-oriented and debate-oriented elements. I like a lot the idea that place matters. Your emphasis to underline the importance of space in the global agendas, and your recommendation to use the scales in terms of causes of pandemic and solution, and to understand how it connects to recovery in the different scales, I believe is extremely important, as well as the need to reconcile economic politics with morphology, and your reference to the G20, and not surprisingly, in my view, and sadly, the omission of place in this important recommendation, which always deal on economics and fiscal space, but to understand much more how place at different scales have an important role to play on this. And I like a lot your comment on density and the architecture and the density at different scales. I believe, Laura, this is an important element, how densities at the territory up to the building play out in these solutions. And your final recommendation, which I believe is extremely important, is to give priority to the priorities. In other words, how space and priorities connect to this, and the notion of building back better, that eventually it's a great opportunity to address many of the all normal problems that were causing this in this building back better, and to integrate morphology that can be changed. Thank you. Obviously, Eugene, I'm just mentioning some of the important points because your presentation or comments were extremely rich in different areas. I just want to highlight, and I'm sure that my colleagues are taking note. I would like to move to the last expert and old colleague from Habitat, old good friend, Roger Vandenberg from the World Resource Institute. He's the Director of Urban Development. Welcome. You will have 8 to 9 minutes to make your points. And just to recall to everyone, I'm taking note of what is in the chat. Immediately after Roger's presentation, we will have a space of 30 minutes for comments and input from the floor, from everyone. As I said at the very beginning, UN Habitat is using this webinar to capture the most important ideas and the most important knowledge and evidence facts coming from all of you. So please feel free to talk, but do it in a short term. Roger, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eduardo. Thank you, colleagues. Happy to be here. It's a very extremely rich discussion. I'm enjoying it, and praise to the work that's been done so far. So really appreciate it. I think it lays out the key thematic areas and the kind of skills that they are relevant at. I already kind of got rid of a couple of comments. I'm not going to do redo comments of others, but let me make 3 main comments and maybe 1 suggestion for more evidence. One is that this report talks about immediate and long-term solutions and interventions, and it's not everywhere that clear. Are we talking now a recovery, a response, or a kind of a new approach to city planning? And I think it's all a bit of both, but it would be really good to articulate that a bit better. And I'll just give you 1 example, because, for example, when you talk about transport and mobility, you talk on one hand about kind of the relevance of these systems in cities, and on the other hand, that riding public transport is not that unhealthy and quite risk-free. But really looking at the data behind what's happening to public transit systems right now, with a 50 to 90% reduction of ridership, with daily losses that kind of national governments try to kind of support with all sorts of packages, is going to be really problematic. So kind of the recovery of kind of public transport systems, which are a tenet of cities, is going to take a couple of years, and there are specific interventions and investments needed to keep them back running. So I think it would be very good to understand what are kind of the bold interventions needed to get back and to recover from the pandemic, and what is kind of a structural issues that the pandemic actually amplified, such as inequality, such as the climate crisis, such as the inaccessibility to services. So it would be good to get more understanding about kind of that bold, bigger project related to the recovery and kind of structural change in city planning and the way that we conceive and plan our cities. So I think that is one point, and I think the public transport system systems chapter requires a bit more attention, because these systems are so hard hit. So all ideas about connectivity, about transit-oriented development are not valid anymore, and it costs a huge amount of money. I think the US now includes a 25 billion in emergency relief for transit agencies. I think Brazil daily loss in terms of transportation or public transport is more than or almost $200 million per day. So these are really complex issues. So, okay, I think I made that point. The second point relates very much, I think, to what Maria said and what Jeannie just said about actions and priorities and how to get things done. I totally agree. It would be extremely helpful to have that section in the beginning of the document, and it would be really good to get more evidence on what you propose in terms of solutions, how we can potentially finance them. And I know this is not a finance and not an urban economy chapter, but it's really some assumptions some assumptions in the draft are just not backed up by evidence. If you look at the $12 trillion of recovery packages, less than 7% takes cities into account as a driver for recovery. And if you look at the recently developed green stimulus index, you see that actually a lot of these recovery investments do not aim at a green recovery. So there's a lot of evidence that is kind of not so positive about how about the kind of the interventions that you propose in the draft that we all here agree with as being kind of good solutions for a lot of kind of intertwined, deeply intertwined problems, the pandemic, climate, and inequality. So it would be really good to make the case again how these interventions can be invested in, And there is evidence. So just pointing out some of the great work that the Coalition of Urban Transitions has done in clearly pointing out how green construction and retrofitting, urban transport and nature-based solutions and a couple of other investments are much better in creating jobs, really much better in creating jobs than kind of old school roads and grey infrastructure. So it would be really good to make that point. I think we are here among friends and practitioners that understand, but I think that point is still not being kind of taken into account by many decision makers, and especially not by Treasury. So that's the second point: how to get things done and provide the evidence that the solutions that are being provided in the document can be financed. So, and we know how to do it. So that is not there's a lot of evidence around that, and I can provide that. Happy to do that. The third thing is related to the discussion on exodus and the future of cities. And I think I was a bit shocked by the blunt statement that we see an exodus of cities because that is not true. It's not backed by evidence, and it would be really good to be a bit more geographically specific. And I think a lot of the narrative about how to address rapid urban growth is kind of a bit lost in this document. I mean, notwithstanding COVID-19, growth in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia of cities is still continuing pretty much at the same pace as it did before. So I think it would be really good to have a bit more of an elaboration on how cities are developing in city and city at the scale of city and city region, and maybe look back briefly at the different stages that we have seen in the last few decades, with city centers being not attractive, city centers being rebuilt, urban renaissance, edge cities, an idea that the internet would completely change our relation with cities, which was not true. So it would be really good to, I think, lay out a bit more of the history of city, urban, and regional growth, because there is not sufficient evidence to say there is an exodus taking place. Actually, I'm currently stuck in the Netherlands, and actually the house prices in the cities are just through the roof, and people kind of, so it would be good to have and since the evidence is not there, I think it would be helpful to shape that narrative on city and city region being a dynamic that needs to be taken into account seriously. Then a last few points, because I can't talk for a long time because I'm excited what's on the table right now. But a couple of last points. I think the evidence around nature-based solutions and urban water resilience is, I think, weaker than it's rather weak. I think there is much more evidence about the benefits of investing in green infrastructure, in nature-based solution. And among others, our Cities for Forest platform and network developed a lot of this, also together with the World Bank. So I would be happy to refer to that. And I think the other topic is urban water resilience. Of course, water and green infrastructure is part of your considerations, but this is going to be a huge urgency in sub-Saharan Africa. Not only in terms of kind of access to sanitation, access to water, but it's going to be a huge issue in terms of conflict, in terms of kind of how cities are going to fight and secure their own water provision in the future. Last point to make is our World Resources report that really, last time that I was in this session, I made a plea for the access to urban services rather than to talk about density, because density is only the precondition for urban services to exist. The report will be released before the end of the year. So hopefully, and of course takes into account a couple of kind of key considerations related to COVID-19. So hopefully you have the time still to kind of have a glance and to look at that report in order to take note of these issues around access to services as a driver for equity or equality in cities. I'm at 9 minutes, 38 seconds. I see Eduardo move nervously, so I'm going to stop. Thank you very much.
On the contrary, I really enjoy, Roger, your comments. Thank you very much for these 4 points. I'm sure the team coordinated by Laura took notes. I would like just to highlight some of your points. The first one, and I think all of us, we do agree that this section of the report will benefit from a better articulation on the phases of the response, on what is the meaning of recovery, particularly when we talk about city planning, and some structural issues that the pandemic is bringing, and how we will play with the morphology and space that obviously are also part of some structural responses. Your second point on the how is extremely valid, and thank you for making this recommendation. Some noises here. Particularly on the idea that actions and priorities require evidence for solutions on how to finance, not only on how to do it. And I think this is extremely important. It brings something that you touch indirectly, but I would like to make a recommendation, not only to Laura, but to all our colleagues that are connected from the other sections, and to see the interconnectivity or interconnectedness of this report with the different elements that we are analyzing. And here your point is very clear, connecting to the urban economy element of this. I like also a lot your idea or the need to think in terms of a new narrative of geography and city development, city stories, city scales. And I agree with you. One of the reports that we produced, we said that the world has been moving in terms of urban growth and development to different forms of large agglomerations like urban corridors, mega regions. And the question, Laura, will be how these mega regions and urban corridors that are in fact different forms of city regions connect to your notion of territoriality and connect to city responses. Understanding, for instance, that in one of the reports that we just produced, we said that today in the world, something like 20% of the population were living in these large urban conglomerates, and they represented something that 44% of global economic output. So it's an important connection to that. And your last point that I cannot more than agree on the need of natural-based solutions and the importance to connect to green infrastructure. And we look forward to hear from your report on the World Resource Institute. Colleagues, we have finalized the feedback from the expert panel. And now I'm going to open the floor for comments and inputs. And before doing that, I would like to read for you some of the things that were written in the chat, because that is the idea of the chat. But still, if anyone from the chat would like to comment, is welcome to do so. Remember, there is a small hand on the panel where you can push there, and our technician, Leon, will open the micro for you. I forgot to mention something very important that Ralph wrote to Eugene, and is this idea of the platform. We would like really to take this and to see how, not only for these sections of this report, but how we can create a more permanent feature, a sort of platform for research, analysis, data, and this is extremely valid. Laura and colleagues from this group, I don't know if you had been reading, but let me summarize from you some of these points, perhaps with the detriment of not giving prominence to some of the comments, and sorry in advance for that. The first one is to consider in the scale analysis more gender-related issues. And I saw two, one on the public space, and the second one on gender violence, and how planning can play an important role on this. There was a comment that was sent to me on how really agriculture connects to the notion of morphology. And if perhaps to think that morphology is also functionality, but this notion of form and function, how they can be connected. There was another comment on green areas and public space, and the need, Laura, that to give more detailed analysis to green areas in your recommendation. Our colleague Asushi made 4 under 5 points that I think all of them are extremely relevant. I just summarize them. When we talk about territories and scales, not all of them are affected the same way. So how in your study you introduce this notion of who is more affected and how. And then the connection to locational choices in terms of redesigning the way we move in the city, where we live, and the notion of outmigration and vocation that is extremely important, as well as digitalization in the different territories, and the need to analyze mobility in this. Our colleague from Colombia, Manrique, talked about the importance of adequate housing and the need to consider different forms of participation and the expression of citizens in cities. Sofhan mentions again the importance of gender violence and neighborhood planning, and Michela makes a point that I really wanted to comment when our colleague Daniel was making this presentation, and it's perhaps in your weak spots to differentiate rates of mortality and rates of infection. I read in one report from Brazil that poor population and even black and white population in some places were getting the same rate of infection, but obviously they were not getting the same rate of mortality. And this connects to Michelle's comment on the need to integrate health medical capacities in the territory as a way of analyzing this. And finally, there is a comment from Lucia, our colleague, on how spatial planning can really connect and serve in terms of informal and slum settlements for service delivery. The floor is open. In addition to this, I don't think we are expecting understanding the way, the dynamic of this webinar. We are not expecting comments from Laura to these general comments, more for her to take note. And at the end of this presentation, our director, Raf Toots from Global Solution Division, will have 10 minutes to wrap up and to make some comments. But anyone that would like to take the floor and make 1 2-minute comment is welcome. Remember, for us, your comments and your inputs in this discussion are extremely important. This is the way we make progress. This is the way we interrogate our uncertainties. And this is the way we really understand that perhaps we are not seeing all the picture, and I'm sure we are not. And there is a need to I don't see any hands up. Raf is mentioning at the end, let me see. Yes, please write your comments in the chat in case you cannot raise your hand in this feature that is there. But is anyone would like to make any additional comment to what I mentioned, or believe what I said is not complete and you would like to make more clear suggestions and recommendations or comment? So the floor is yours. Who would like to make any suggestion? Please. Okay, Lucia, please. The floor is yours. Lucia? You might be mute, I guess, because I cannot hear anything from you.
Oh, God. Yeah, okay. Thanks, Eduardo, and thanks to all the panelists and those who have made comments in the chat. I'm thinking that given that elaboration of Jeannie Batch's comment on G20 and the lack of connection between economy, finance, and space, maybe this chapter should make a link between those space, financial analysis, and like. And I don't know whether it is the introduction of the whole book, which will show the connectivity between the different chapters. Because I can see, you know, the relationships between inequality and finance and all this governance and like, so I believe that the introductory chapter will be able to draw all those connections and then go into the specificities. But the linking of spatial analysis with financial analysis, it is us to make that argument and to begin to encourage others to do something about it. Because there are wider, you know, issues concerning how the whole COVID-19 has evolved and what has been the role of urban actors, even in terms of advocacy. In my view, urban actors have not been in the center of discussions for COVID-19, and that has had an impact on the response thereafter by the national and local governments. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Lucia, for your comment. I can see Laura taking note. Let me now, because of time, and also I have seen some people leaving the chat, I would like to take advantage because I know that our Director of Global Solution Division is excellent in making some summary comments on this and closing remarks. So, Raf, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eduardo, and thanks for the good moderation. I think it was a very substantive session, and I can really see a lot of progress from where we were in June, and that has also been reflected by our colleagues, Tiago, Maria, Danielle, Jeannie, and Rohir. I liked for each of them their perspectives and their constructive comments and very substantive comments, which I'm sure the team will take into account. This was wonderful. Just to highlight a few elements that I think we have to consider, and I'm not going to repeat anything that Eduardo has already highlighted, because I think he did a good job in picking out the most salient issues in terms of the comments, but some of the things we need to address, and not only for this chapter, but I think for the whole publication. First of all, the evidence has to be, or let's say the message has to be proportional to the evidence. I think it's something that we need to make sure that sometimes we can make a message stronger if the evidence is more significant, and we need to calibrate that carefully. We need to think about our language. We know our target group is city leaders, policymakers, planners. It's a broader target group. It is not the whole interested community in this broad topic, but it is also not very specialized, and we need to match our language with this broader influencing target group. We got an endorsement of this concept of you working with scales, and I think it's a very strong concept that works well. But what we need to do perhaps is to prioritize amongst the different proposals that we make for each scale level. I think this is very well taken, and it will not be an easy call, but we will need to do it to make the report and the recommendations even sharper. we need to balance North and South evidence if we can, and maybe find a bit more examples from the South, and also highlight the urgency in different parts of the world to respond. And then we need to move slightly from the what to the how, meaning what needs to change, and then how we need to change it to make it even more practical, even more operational. And this is important because this is not just a report. We have said from the beginning that this is, for us, a recalibration also of our own guidance, of our own normative guidance as we move forward in 2021 and beyond. And we need to take into account comments and directions into our own normative guidance, which we will do through our urban practices and our work in the countries. Anyway, let me just say a few words about the next steps. But before that, well, next step. We have recorded this session, and we record all the 4 sessions, so everyone is free to come back and look at what happened this afternoon. And the presentation will be posted here. Please don't quote. This is not a published document. We be inspired by it, but it's not yet finalized. It's still work in progress. We will review the comments carefully, and please feel free to send further written comments, but don't wait too long. I think it's very important to do that before the 10th of December, when we are closing the 4 chapters. And then we're going to put everything together gradually in December and in January, and come up with a published document by the end of January, beginning of February. So we still have 2.5 months to do this. And as I said, this is not the end. This is just one step, a milestone towards our normative recalibration, and perhaps also towards a platform of studies, as was suggested this afternoon, to further reflect on this topic as new evidence is generated, especially on impact of the measures. So thank you so much. I will also thank specifically the panelists, also Eduardo for the moderation, also of course Laura, Alain, Herman, and the rest of the team for their efforts over the last 6 months in bringing this forward. And also special thanks to Paula, Iris, and Laura for moving specifically the webinars forward. So we value your input, and we hope you have enjoyed the session. Looking forward to meeting you again in one of the other webinars. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ralph. Thank you very much for your comments. Yes, it's important to mention that this is a team working on this, and let's give recognition to everyone: Alan Grimard, Herman Pinar, and Tara Tandon, Van Edley, Charlotte Mohan, and Helen Yu, and of course, other than the leadership and coordination of Laura Patrella, and overall with Ralph Toots as a overall coordinator of this report. I want, on behalf of UN Habitat, to say thank you to all of you for your participation, for your comments, for your interest, and to invite you tomorrow at the same time than today for the urban economy discussion of this chapter, and to recommend that you connect next week on Tuesday for the 3rd section of this, and the 4th on Wednesday, that will be the urban inequality, and then the urban governance and normative aspects of these discussions. Thank you, Laura, for your work, for your presentation. Thank you to the experts that connected and made such valuable comments, and we will continue making progress for this important report. Thank you to all of you.